There we go. Hello. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in tonight to Assembly Online. Just making sure the microphone is coming through. Priscilla Anderson, Nick Hallett, nice to hear from you in the chat. Thanks for saying hello. Great. Okay, get right to it. Tonight we're joined by 11 Firehouse. 11 Firehouse gathers together the artists Gaelin Little, Tara Silverthorn, Lucille, Teppa and Sarah Westwood. And they'll be joining us tonight on Zoom, and along with Sarah Westwood, who composed the music for the piece Circle of Perpetual Choirs, which they'll be discussing tonight. It's a piece that's performed in the round, and their discussion will be mixed with video recordings of when they rehearsed it at Siobhan Davies Studios. So they will be giving an introduction, we'll be going to put a video, and they'll be giving a bit more context to it, and there's some audio as well. Now I'll let them lead it, and we'll be back at the end for any questions that you have that you want to pose in the YouTube chat, and I'll read them out to the 11 Firehouse as a group for them to answer your questions. So now I'm going to hopefully pass over to the Zoom call with Tara, who's going to introduce the piece.
Thanks, Henry.
Sorry, I'm having. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think you're through.
Great. Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here with us tonight to listen to us discussing some perspectives on movement, sound and process through the lens of one of our works, as Henry's mentioned, which is called Circle of Perpetual Choirs. And thanks, Henry, for introducing us. So with me, I've got the other members of the group, Gaelin, Lucille, Kat, and the composer for the work, Sarah, who collaborated with us on this project. And I will take the lead on this conversation tonight with Sarah, as I'm the initiator and the choreographer of this particular work. So I hope you're all right out there, and that you find tonight's screening interesting and illuminating in some way, and that you maybe discover something that you didn't know before about processes of making choreography and sound. So I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about 11 Firehouse, who we are and how we work. So we're a group of 4 artists and friends, fundamentally, who trained and lived together over a decade ago. And we formed 11 Firehouse in 2013 after spending quite some years as active artists pursuing our own interests in the fields of dance, performance and choreography in our own ways, which of course we still do. And our years living together throughout our training had created a deep bond between us, which fortuitously ended up becoming the foundation of a collaborative relationship. Over many conversations and cups of tea, we realized that we wanted to help to empower each other and ourselves to be able to make and experiment together sustainably. So practically what this means is that we take it in turns to initiate projects, which are all of equal value to us, regardless of the form or aesthetic that they end up taking. Initiation constantly shifts between us. And this questions the common way of thinking about leadership in terms of an individual who takes charge. Our experience as a collective is actually that leadership can sometimes be the most uncomfortable and challenging role. which requires both meeting and adapting to the other, and a kind of holding of an underlying coherent process. So in effect, maintaining a kind of holding space. And we've come to realize that it's the job of the others in the group to support the leader, or actually we use the word initiator, to fulfill her role in service to the development of the artistic work. So just to give you a little bit of a wider context about the work, in 2016, the idea came about to begin a project that would become a piece that we'll talk to you about tonight, Circle of Perpetual Choirs. And the title is borrowed from a myth about 10 ancient choirs who were equally spaced at various important sites in Britain, such as Stonehenge and Glastonbury, and I believe there's one in Wales. And the choirs would maintain their songs day and night in order to enchant the land and keep the people in harmony with the universe, which I thought was quite a lovely idea. It's also said to be a formation of ley lines or energetic lines between these sites, supposedly, and these ley lines form a kind of succession of rings. So tonight we'll show some excerpts of a document of this performance that took place, as Henria mentioned, at Siobhan Davies Studios in London in autumn 2018. Needless to say that the film is actually just a document, so please forgive that it's not the best quality. And it's also filmed from the outside, meaning that you of course can't get the sense of what the choreography is like from the audience perspective. But hopefully this can still give you some kind of flavour of the things we will talk about. So you will see that the audience are centred in the space in a ring, with the choreography happening all around them. From the beginning, I was interested in offering people another way of engaging with movement and choreography that disrupts the usual way that we consume work, which can be similar to the passive sitting and watching in the same way that we do when we look at a screen. So I wanted to create a more intimate and felt experience where the senses are more actively called upon. And the in the round setup came from this. The piece doesn't actually step into a fully immersive audience experience. There are still some boundaries for performers and audience members, but it asks the audience to engage differently with what it means to watch choreography, calling on the other senses as a means of perceiving. And the setup was actually also inspired by a work that I went to see at the new Tape performance and installation space, which was a piece called 40-Part Motet by the artist Janet Cardiff. It was an audio installation of a choral piece called Spem Allium by Thomas Alice. And each voice in the choral piece was played through one of 40 individual speakers that were arranged in a circle. And I was really struck by the feeling of being surrounded and engulfed by song. And I started to imagine and envisage choreography happening all around me in this huge hexagonal concrete space. And what I also found really presence of people, mode of listening. There was a real intimacy and a gentle sense of togetherness to it that I really enjoyed. The people could make choices about how they listened to the singing. They were free to move around in the space and experience each voice up close or surrounded by the whole song. And I really appreciated that aspect of the work.
Hello, Tara.
Hi.
I'm Hi, I'm Sarah. I was the composer for this piece. And I'd just like to interrupt you there because what I found interesting is when you mentioned you wanted to create an intimate and felt experience where senses are more actively called upon. I wasn't actually aware of Janet Cardiff's installation piece and inspired you in some way to make this piece. The installation sounds fantastic, and the impact it had on you working in the circle, I can really tell from when I first watched the rehearsals. When I did first see the rehearsals, I first came to this piece by watching them on the videos. I wasn't aware, I was already aware, sorry, that there was an intimate sound environment needed for both the performer and the audience, and that the sound needed to support the movement. I had the idea to have multiple sound sources from surround sound and also from within the audience circle. And it just came to me from watching your movements rather than hearing about your initial inspiration. When a mutual understanding during collaboration happens without spoken dialogue or explanation, the collaborative dynamics in the final piece are different, because I feel if you'd said how you were inspired in the first place, the sound would have turned out completely differently, which isn't a bad thing. But I think on this occasion, to start on the sound from an intuition on what you had wanted, I think worked well, because I began to map out what I felt the sounds wanted to be from a meditative point, which I feel really lends to the idea of the movement and ideas of this piece as the movements I can see, and you'll say come from you as individuals. And I think that's a nice reflection on the movement process and the music process all coming from ourselves rather than one idea that you've told us to make.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I agree. It's always really a thing of magic when collaborations happen that way in the kind of unspoken, unsaid realm. So thanks for mentioning that. So in a moment we will show you a clip of the beginning section of the piece. We've talked a lot about kind of details of the work, so this will give you a sense of how things look. And we call this opening section the radar, and you'll probably see why. We begin by steadily mapping the space around the audience together in a kind of radar formation. Here we establish a clear, simple rhythm and a sense of togetherness, which sets the tone for the work and allows a kind of slowing down to drop in the space. The time that this part takes tells the audience that this will not be a flashy piece. It's also a time for the audience to get used to how they will start to orient to us moving around them and their seating. So bringing them into their bodily experience of seeing and perceiving. So I'm going to hand over to Henry now to play that first clip. And hopefully you should. Okay, there you go. Handing over to Sarah. I think she's got something to say.
Hello. Yes, that was a clip from earlier on in the piece, and it gives you a sense of the start and the pace of the overall dance project. But what I wanted to say was there was something when I first started thinking about the sounds, if you could hear a bit of them on YouTube, was that I found the way they danced and their movement was very intimate. And I wanted to highlight that in the spatialization of sound. So I'll talk a bit about that because unfortunately you can't quite get the depth of the sound on headphones or on the computer. I wanted to create an intimate space, so I thought about using many speakers to help with this idea. From the rehearsal videos, I knew immediately I wanted to play with a large landscape and have the sound from beyond the dancers. So you'll see that there's the usual venue speakers of 4 channels plus bass subwoofer, and also have sound coming right to where the audience were seated. And sometimes have the sound follow the dancer, which is further away, or have the sound close to one or all of the audience. So the outer sphere of the speakers, I called them the outer sphere. And then I had a vast array of smaller speakers. I'm not sure if you saw them in the video, but they were hidden under the stalls, and I called them the inner sphere. There were many reasons why I wanted to use space within sound, and many composers like using space. But one important point to make was that the use of sound as a landscape, not just as the intimate use as I described just now, to make a detailed sound for the audience, close to them and far away, but also to create sections or breaks within the space that I liken to lighting or scenery. As it's in the round, there is a continuity throughout watching it, the repetitive nature of working with circles. With sounds, it's possible for me to think about other layers that the dancers could work with, like an overlay to the circle. And I did that by using each individual speaker as a voice of its own. I wanted to create different areas within the sound, which would sometimes provide a similar motion to the dancer. So they might be going circular, a sense of grounding, which I called deep sound, which would be quite weighty, and crossover areas where the dancers couldn't go, as it either wouldn't fit with the choreography or the layout of the space. So it wouldn't make sense for them to run diagonally because the audience was there. So I would be able to do that with sound. So go from one speaker to another across the space.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So just to divert a little bit and elaborate a little bit on the choreographic aspect of that section. So we worked for a really long time actually on understanding the seemingly really simple task of maintaining a line that always orients to the center of the circle. In practice, this is in fact a continual negotiation of micro adjustments between the 4 of us, our own bodies, the space, and the pace of walking. It's also a time for us to establish a deep listening between us as a 4, which flickers back and forth across the line. Perhaps you noticed that eventually audience members start to choose not to look with their eyes. They're less in their vision sense, and they become more inclusive of their hearing and their backspace in the watching. So seeing becomes three-dimensional. People begin to move on their seats, and so viewing becomes an active, embodied experience. What this eventually means is that people have to let go of trying to see and grasp everything with their vision. You can't hold it all in your vision as you might in a traditional theatre setting. So what happens is that they begin to let the choreography come to them. It's because of this that the work happens in these cyclical, multiple iterations, in order that people can return and witness what they might have missed, or to view the work again in a different way. So when Kat branches off from the line, the notion of soloing or individuation is introduced, and indicating to the audience that their attention will need to start splitting off in different directions. And by the way, brownie points for anyone who managed to spot which famous dance Kat's doing in slow motion in that part. So just to talk to you a bit more about the solos. You won't see all of the solos tonight in the clips that we've chosen, but they are the building blocks for the work. And they originally emerged out of a wish to enter a process where individual material could be supported by the whole group. And we spent several weeks meticulously translating bird songs into our bodies, which had been considerably slowed down. And if you're interested, after this talk, you can actually listen to one of the songs in a hyperlink, I believe, on the website, on the Assembly Online website, which is a recording of a bird that's slowed down to about 60% of its original speed. And many thanks to Libero Colimberti for the use of this. So in general, I'm really interested in the practice of slowing down, both physically and perceptually, in order to create a greater attunement to details and to deepen the felt experience of movement and choreography. And what was interesting to notice when we received comments and feedback after performing was that people said that the work actually enabled them to slow down. And some elaborated on that and said it was like having an experience of being in nature. So the piece appeared to be acting on people by having a calming or soothing effect. So the idea of slowing things down seemed to be pervading the work on many levels. And the bird songs gave us a strange and unique framework for making. And at the time I was interested in the feeling of moving as sounding, which working with the songs helped to facilitate and kind of give a framework for, as there was this internal music eventually going on that became inextricable from the movement. And during the process, we each chose songs that spoke to us in some way, or that we enjoyed or found curious in some way to work with. And Kat has very generously agreed to actually, because her solo won't be shown on film tonight, to give you a little kind of walk and talk sounding experience of a bit of her solo. So I'm going to hand over to Kat now.
Sure. Hi. Yes, so when we chose our bird song to work with and to make movement, I guess it wasn't about literally moving with the sound of the birds slow down, but the fact of how we respond with the sound either with our bodies or with the space around us. So I feel it more like sculpting sound around, and also sculpting with movement. And sometimes I felt the sound would like go through me, or sometimes it like simple as my shoulder is making the sound of this slow down bird song. So there's two little bits I'd like to show. I'm just going to take my headphones off because I know I'll pull my laptop with me. So I'll stand up as well. So I have this very melancholy sounding bird song. He sounds in my head like a very sad flute player. So it makes the sound of doot 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 doot. So this movement I have several times, and sound several times in my solo. And the one that I'd like to show you is I'm standing with my back to the audience, and I have my hands up quite high, and my hands, as they're up high, they make this like pressing movement with the palms to the rhythm of this kind of melancholic bird. I also have this image with it that I'm actually standing on the edge of a cliff, and my hands aren't just moving with the movement of the sound, but I have this sense that with the sound, it's kind of like the sound's coming from my hand and I'm pressing. So it's like a textured sound, like I can almost touch the sound with my hands. So it's more like doot, 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 doot. So there's this kind of quality and texture within the solo and the piece that I feel in my body. And the other moment that I feel is quite special, that perhaps the audience won't see as well, as my back is towards the witnesses, which I realise actually Sarah's normally sat in the corner live mixing the sound, and she's the only one that can see me do this moment. And I have my hands up quite high, and it's like I watch the sound bounce from one thumb to the other. So like this, do 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 do, and only Sarah gets to see that moment of a ping pong sound. So yeah, that's just a short snippet of what goes on in my birdie solo. Thank you, Tara.
Great, thanks, Kat. So from the onset, we began to question and physically explore together how the three of us can help to support the making of these different birdie solos. And we would work with the practices of sharing and witnessing what we made and feeding back to each other, as well as experimenting with being simply physically present for one another's solos in the space. So there was this kind of dual process happening.
Yeah, I'm just going to cut in here because the short clip that we showed you, you might think I didn't hear any bird song in the sound. So when I first came to this project, I was aware that 11 Farrer House had spent time working on translating birdsong slowly into their bodies. And whilst birdsong made a deep impression on the movement, I didn't want to translate this into sound, as I had a feeling that this translation was more of a way of them to sculpt a particular sound internally for each dancer, rather than a dancer mimicking birds and then my composition mirroring birdsong. So when I watched the rehearsals on the video, I thought about what the movement said to me. I watched in silence for a number of times. I didn't actually listen to the bird songs until after I'd started coming up, after I'd come up with ideas for myself, actually. And during this process, I was working on ideas on spacing, on timbre, texture, and weight came to my mind. A loose structure and layout came as well, but I wanted to present it to 11 House first in our rehearsals before I really started to mould the piece. But I'll talk more about that later on.
Yeah, thanks. And just to perhaps embellish a little bit more on our making process, we worked on playing rather than dancing. So playing as an orchestra or a band would play in the space, rather than imagining what might look good in a particular moment. And our experience of moving and relating in space was informed by a daily improvisation practice around this. We also worked with this idea of listening to the whole, so listening to the whole space and everything that's happening inside of it, imagining and moving as if we were a band that created sounds through our moving, and contributing to the moving soundscape. This then became true of the work, and composing it also became about what is quiet and loud, which tones are crossing and blooming, what's high-pitched and what's deep and bassy in your experience. And I was also interested in fine details and how they can be allowed to sing and be elevated. So the subtle folding of a hand becoming very loud, or equally big energetic strokes through the space feeling really light and breezy, or the stillness seeming to shimmer as we connect across the space. So maybe Sarah, could you talk a little bit about how the sound for you supports this this kind of juxtaposition or different qualities of moving?
Yeah, of course. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to play with the space as well for the dancers and create a juxtaposition and different trajectory of movement sometimes. But I also felt it was necessary to be supportive of them due to the way they moved. I thought about creating a bubble that surrounded the dancers and the audience that was suspended in time. This naturally led me to think about the timbral qualities. Tara mentioned earlier the idea of dancers singing, the ancient myth of the 10 ancient pyres, the dancers listening to the whole, the tones which are crossing and blooming. And from this, I was drawn to qualities of a singing bowl, and not just the repetitive circular nature of physically making the bowl sing, and also the different sizes and different pitches and variations, all within this homogeneous drone that can also create lots of overtones just within one bowl. But I didn't want this to be a collection of singing bowls playing from different speakers. I wanted it to have movement and rhythm and different voices, so to speak. So I decided to record a vast collection of metallic sounds and created this continuous singing by overlaying them. Some of them were, I did actually record singing bowls, but some of them were cowbells, some of them are metallic objects from the house, or just stuff that I found and I recorded. And I imagined this would create my bubble around the space. And certain moments in the dance could be brought out or sculpted by using specific speakers and certain metallic sounds. The metallic layering created a fairly homogeneous quality of sounds, and I felt it created a meditative landscape from this. Tara discussed earlier on about using quietness and loudness in movement, and I'll briefly explain about how I use this in composition. It's interesting, Tara, she talked about the subtle folding of a hand becoming very loud, or equally big energetic strokes through space feeling light and breezy. I think the same analogy can be used in music. Obviously, dynamics play a large role in shaping and moving the sound, but when you think of the quietness and loudness, it's again on multiple levels. I supported the loudness and quietness in this piece by using a variety of speakers, which could be, for example, I used all of them in a very quiet moment, but I used them with particular sounds that sometimes were strong but quiet. Sometimes when there were loud movements or moments, I would choose several that were possibly behind and next to the dancer that I wanted to give strength to. For example, with Gaelin's solo, I used a lot of bass. I thought that worked well. And with Tara, she moves into the inner circle. I'm not sure if you'll see this, but she goes inside and dances in the very middle around the audience were around her. And I used all the inner speakers there, kind of panning, and I called that the inner strength circle. So I chose the certain sounds and music to support them and highlighted them. Most of the changes I made were gradually over time, and I mixed it live so it could really match the shape and sound of the dancers. When you hear the different clips, you might, on this YouTube discussion, you might be able to tell that there are large differences between the clips, but if you watch it over a half an hour performance, it will be a very gradual change in mood.
Yeah, and just to mention also this aspect of pattern or rhythm that comes in that you will have seen emerging in the clip that you watched. So sometimes we choreographically we're very insistent with a pattern or a rhythm, giving it time to kind of imprint or land in the space, almost to the point where people might meet the edge of boredom. And then inside of that, there might be a detail happening that perhaps nobody or just one person will witness happening. And throughout the work, we sometimes help to guide the audience's attention to these fine details or events with how we frame what's happening. And sometimes that's with our gaze, where we look, suggesting that something's happening over there.
I'd also like to add on a similar thread that during the collaboration, we also worked on guiding the attention of the audience through sound. I mentioned that I had a loose idea on structure before rehearsals, but I really wanted to mould this more when I was actually working with them in the space. So when we were at Siobhan Davies Dance Studio, we had, I think, a week, quite a long time to really work on sculpting the sound with the dancers. I plotted several points within the dance to have different moments and atmospheres, and I worked with them to really shape it. I felt that all of 11 Firehouse during the rehearsals, they were helping me to choose and time which speakers and what to bring out. Kat mentioned earlier I was working from where the camera angle is, so although sometimes I did walk around the space, it was really nice to hear how the sound felt to the dancers in another area of the studio.
Yeah. Yeah, so just kind of, I guess, following on about this idea of what it means to guide attention. you can see this happening in the following clip that we're going to show, where Kat witnesses other events taking place, sending her attention elsewhere. And not only does this create a kind of energetic crossing through the audience's space, which then includes them within the choreographic field, but in this particular instance, it also eventually serves to create a kind of little surprise for the audience as Kat seemingly disappears in their awareness until they actually hear her removing her shirt, which is made of a thick kind of crinkly plasticky material, which makes a subtle sound. So we're going to jump forwards now in time in the work towards the end of the work, and I'm going to hand over to Henry again for this next clip, which you should see soon. Okay. So we worked with distance and periphery and closeness to create a kind of textured weave of intensities and modes of attention. So you might have noticed that sometimes something will be happening right at the edges of the space, and then there are moments where we actually enter the circle, as Sarah mentioned just now, into the audience's space. The comparative experience of those two spaces is interesting. I perform part of my solo within the circle, and when I made it, I imagined that this would feel quite intense and had the potential to be kind of uncomfortable. However, there was a softness within the circle, and the presence of the audience often felt incredibly warm, which meant that this meeting space had an effortless quality. Whereas to me, working in the edges of the circle felt more like a place where we were observed, as the audience's gaze had more of a kind of spectator quality to it at this distance. So I wanted to ask Lucille if you wouldn't mind commenting on your experience of this proximity or perhaps circularity within your material.
Yes, proximity I feel maybe is not so relevant to me, just because during the performance I don't feel like I'm never really that close to the audience or close for a long time to really experience that proximity. But the circularity, definitely, and I can say a word about how actually the specific setup of the piece, with the audience in the middle and in around, I feel actually affects me as a performer, and because I think we are rather used to more conventional setups where we have a very frontal relationship with the audience, and which means that we have some degree of control over what's seen of us or what we know is seen of us, and over how our bodies are exposed to the audience. And here what happens is that this relationship to the audience becomes very 3D, three-dimensional. It happens through the front, this frontal relationship, but to me, I feel it happens a lot through my backspace. I actually do present my back a lot to the audience, I realized throughout the performance, which is quite unusual. And so this three-dimensional awareness and relationship to the audience, where sometimes we also feel that we can be surrounded by the audience gaze, which is very unusual too, is very specific and very exposing. And actually the audience themselves also have some sort of power on that relationship, I find, because sometimes I can be behind them, for instance, but if they decide as active members actually to turn around to look at me, then they are putting me again in a position where I am exposed. And I have to be prepared for that in a way. So I feel like the setup really keeps you on your toes. I'd say that's my experience of it, and it is unsettling in that sense, and also opens a sense of vulnerability. Actually, for me as a performance, I feel like I enter a vulnerable space where my senses are affected, and where my ears open and my awareness of what's behind my back, of what might be going on behind me, increases through other senses than seeing. And I feel that this ties in a lot, Tara, with everything you've been talking about in terms of sound, but also in terms of like performing the piece. I feel calls on other senses as the way of perceiving as well, and of being aware of everything that happens around us. And that ties in also with what you talked about in terms of sound, and in terms of this presence in the mode of listening, because I feel like performing the piece is about, so as I said, opening my ears and listening to the sound, but as a whole, the sound of my movements, so the sound of my dance, the sound of your dances, the sound of Sarah and all of the details and all of the textures that she talked about, all the directions, and also on top of that, the sound of the audience, which is new as well every time. And again, we're back to this thing of it being a bit unsettling, but in a good way, I find, in a way that increases the senses and in a way that increases a sense of presence, I feel. So it's a layered and rich experience for me.
Thanks, Lucille.
Yeah. Lucille, the way you described the awareness of your front and back and the senses and reminds me of the weight and dimension of sound. When I was making this for you, I was not just thinking about the 2D front of sound or even the layering of sound this way. For example, you may hear the cowbells or the percussion at the beginning of the work, but as you're surrounded by it and also on multiple levels for a suspended time and become involved in seeing and hearing the dance, you begin to remove I hope you begin to remove the association of the object and hear the qualities and weight and dimensions of the sound. And what I mean by that is the sound begins to take a physical shape separate from whatever was making the noise in the first place. And you begin to hear and feel the physical qualities of the sound, as well as hearing and feeling the physical qualities of the movement. That's the feedback I've got from it so far anyway, and that was also part of my intention as well. So, yeah.
Okay, so we're going to show another clip now where where Gaelin actually acknowledges the action of seeing and being seen, where she witnesses the audience in a moment of facing each other. So I'm going to hand over to Henry there. Okay, so Gaelin, I wonder if you could say a little something about what that moment is like for you in your experience.
Yeah, thanks, T. Yeah, so that's an interesting, can you hear me? Yeah, that's an interesting moment for me as a performer. So throughout the years, I've been curious through something that can arise in the act of performing, which is a feeling of dissociation with the audience. And I think this arises out of a almost coping strategy, really, in the kind of on what it means to be before an audience, before other people, and the kind of vulnerability that arises in that. And so I've been, as a performance practicing, working with that. And so one of the ways that I work with that is through sensitizing myself, opening the senses to the audience. But I've struggled with opening my gaze, so making eye contact with the audience, the vision sense. And I think this is because when you meet another's gaze, it can become very charged very quickly. It kind of brings in a sense of the personal, and it has a kind of weight or sentimentality that I struggle with. It brings me out of my performing world and jumps me into another space. And so what is arising here, so I have the gaze of my three fellow performers. They're witnessing me as I'm dancing and moving. We have an image there that it's like that they're a pack of lionesses settled, witnessing me on the floor. And as I come to sitting, it's often a kind of chance encounter. So sometimes it will be that I arrive and I meet the gaze of another audience member, and sometimes I'm kind of just arrive and I'm looking into the general audience space. But I think that there's something about the two feelings of support from behind, and also the vulnerability of being in the performing and the meeting of those two things, which it has brought about a different quality. And I have the image of meeting a wild animal in the forest, and when you catch their gaze for a moment and you're looking at each other, but you have a sense that you're from two different worlds. So it's a different kind of seeing, or two different worlds, or two different consciousnesses. Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks, Gaelin. So just to elaborate on that, actually, the three of us lionesses behind Gaelin are also looking at the audience, but through her. That's an action that we're doing when we're there as well, just to, perhaps that's interesting to know. So I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about an energetic shift that happens in our level of activity towards the very end of the work, as we lie on the ground and we merge our listening with the audience. And all of us together tune into a vocal piece that's played very loud in the space, and nothing happens movement-wise at this time. We listen. And this piece really cuts through and fills the room like movement. And we'll play that for you in a moment. I think Sarah has a few things to say about that first.
Yeah, I felt when I was watching you that there was a complete shift here too. I originally imagined something drastic should happen. Either it would be silence, or I introduce another sound rather than the homogeneous metallic sounds that have been throughout the rest of the piece. During the start of the rehearsal period, I became more and more convinced to play this song at the end, but I wasn't sure how you'd react to it, as it creates a very different space to the one that we'd been making for the last half an hour. I loved the juxtaposition that the song at the end could create. To me, I chose this as it felt like a sorbet or an espresso after a really complex, rich meal. I imagined the metallic soundscape as being very meditative, internal, almost trance-like. And then this, as you said, just to cut straight through to the heart of the circle. I didn't want it to be abrasive, and I felt that the audience would accept these sounds as a refreshing break from the main sounds. The singer you'll hear is Bonnie Lander, and it's taken from a collection of open scores that I made with voice and saxophone, and I created them a few years ago. And coincidentally, these were made whilst I was watching dance, so it's quite a nice feedback back into movement. I call this section my coda to end the piece, and I imagine Kat, which is her solo taking place, would create a delayed canon from hearing this, even though her movements were created before suggesting this sound.
Okay, great. So hopefully that was a refreshing palate cleanser from all the talking that's been happening. I think that we're going to spend the last 5 minutes taking any questions that you might have. So fire away.
They should be able to hear me now. I think I was talking to the Zoom call, but the audience can hear me. So just forwarding a couple of questions from the YouTube chat. Rachel said, in the first clip, the shadows of the audience in the centre resembled a sewn circle. Was this intentional? And was your choice of clothing curated in any way?
Was the clothing? Did you say?
Yeah, and was your choice of clothing curated in any way?
Okay. So just to talk a bit about that's a really lovely observation and reflection, and actually that's kind of accidental about the shadows. That happens because, well, the way that the lights are set is that the lights throughout the duration of the work actually shift from the center to the periphery. So the audience begin in the light, and then they end somewhat in the dark, and the peripheries of the space are lit most brightly. So there will be also a kind of shifting of shadows that happens that has a kind of temporal, or maybe we could say sunrise, sunset quality to it. But really nice to hear about that. Yeah, that stone circle kind of being invoked by the shadows. So thanks for sharing that. The clothing, we sort of just trust each other to go out and get things based on a color palette. We talked a lot about the color palette actually early on in the work, and the kind of aesthetics that the quality of the work itself was invoking, which was this kind of minimalist quality, but with a kind of elemental nature to it. So we wanted colors which were perhaps metallic. Gaelin's got this kind of rusty color, and then there's a little bit of a kind of super sweet pink going on. So it was a big discussion that we had together for quite a while, actually. I don't know, do any of you want to say anything about that? How the clothes were chosen? Kat?
Yeah, I think also the fact that we went and found kind of our own like outfit, but the fact that they do like tie in with each other. I think what is really nice what you said, Tara, about like Gaelin had like a copper earth color, Lucille's was like shiny, I was a pink one, you had this nice crinkly white top. The fact that we were still like individual, so we still had our like own costumes and our own look, and that I think supported our own solos as well. So we had a different sound, a different look, a different little vibe going on in our small world. Yeah.
Okay, we've got a few questions here from the YouTube, so I just thought I'd skip straight into the next one. From Anne Follows, who said that I like the way the audience transcend the inner and outer circles, some looking inward, some outward. What guidance did you give them?
Well, the guidance is really the choreography. They are completely free to look wherever they like. I even wonder if some people will have spent the whole time following one dancer. This was something I was quite interested in exploring through this multiple iteration setup. I suppose in the crafting of the work, and maybe some of you want to say something about this, but we were always very careful to consider where we were guiding the audience's attention, and again, what was playing most loudly, and what was in a sense kind of disappearing or becoming very quiet and disappearing in the audience's awareness. So as we were making the work, there was a constant consideration not only of what people are seeing, but also what they might be hearing, or what they might be perhaps drawn to through proximity. Or at one point I actually touch an audience member as I come past them out of the circle, and sometimes they won't have seen me coming. So there are little subtle cues, if you like, for how the audience are guided in what they see. And that's okay that everyone will see something completely different. That's part of it. Yeah, thank you for your question, your observation. Yeah, Gaelin.
I was just going to say, we also just really did talk about whether we give the audience instructions or not. There was lots of discussions about that, and we did end up with just two, I think, clear instructions, which was that you can move around on your chairs and you can stand if you need to. So it felt like, a bit of a dialogue about how much freedom and how much permission you give the audience.
So we've got two more questions. The next one's James Epps has said, how do you feel about moments being missed by the audience when someone has a back to the audience, or when multiple movements are taking place? In some ways, missing moments seems closer to life.
Yeah, I agree. Missing moments feels closer to life. I think that that's really for me, the interesting part in terms of how the audience learn to engage with their own experience throughout the duration of the work, and how they are, the agency is given back to them in terms of I guess having to accept that they won't be able to hold everything, or yeah, to kind of grasp everything with the gaze. We're so graspy these days, and we want everything to be a full spectacle that's given to us. And actually, perhaps sometimes we will perceive something in another way than seeing it. So perhaps nothing is missed as well.
And just following on.
Yeah,
from
that's a
that,
similar. It's similar to when I was making the sound. Although I did have I mentioned I made this structure, and we decided it should be mixed live because although they do have specific set movements, occasionally if they perform it, it might take slightly slower. For example, if it's in a different space, the chairs might be positioned just slightly further apart, so it means they walk around slower. So it means then the sound changes fractionally, and it might mean that the next part you might not hear like the full sounds that I've made. And also following from that, I mentioned that I had speakers under the stalls. Sometimes they're so quiet that only the person sat on the chair or someone next to them can hear what's going on because of all the sounds and the creaks on the floor. So I suppose in a way the sound also, you don't get to hear all of it.
Kind of concluding with this question that goes on quite nicely from what you both said, which is, would the performance have benefited by being performed in a round space, for example, an amphitheatre? And this is from Jerome Price.
Could you say the last part of the question again?
Would the performance have benefited by being performed in a round space, for example, an amphitheatre?
Oh yeah, that would be great, wouldn't it?
And the acoustics.
We actually, there was a time where we were improvising, imagining that we were in a completely round space, so a kind of spherical space. And of course, the conception for the idea of the ring was, it happened when I went to see that piece by Janet Cardiff, which was in the hexagonal space in the Tate Modern. So that would be a dream. Anyone else want to say anything about that?
And Melanie and Holly have just said, very inspired by this and love the connections in consciousness that happens between you. Thank you. And so maybe to conclude with that, say thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. Tara, Kat, Gaelin, Sarah, and Lucille. I'm going to go back to me talking just to round up. But thanks all for doing that. Really interesting.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Hello, just me now. So just to round up with what's coming up over the next month. Hope you all enjoyed that. I see Anne Follow saying thank you so much. It's been really interesting listening to your process, watching this performance. David Charles says hi. Yeah. I just ended the Zoom call without realising. Hopefully they've logged in to see you saying this. If not, I'll pass on the message. I just wanted to say that as the programme's every 2 weeks now, rather than every week, The next event will be on June the 11th, which will have Sarah Lowndes joining us. She'll be doing a talk called Vaster Than Empires and More Slow, which will be on Derek Jarman and Prospect Cottage, Douglas Kent, 1987 to 1994. Sarah Lowndes will be reading from her book Contemporary Artists Working Outside the City, Creative Retreat, which was published in 2008. This will be followed by an open discussion with the YouTube chat like tonight, so do tune in for that. There's been some wonderful stuff about Prospect Cottage over the last couple of years, including in March when the Prospect Cottage was received the fundraiser to keep it there and open. So that's great. Following on from that, on June the 25th, we will be rounding up June with another international poetry reading. The first one was very popular, and we've confirmed all the guests for this one. It will again be hosted by Kai Draper. Sorry, I'm just seeing the YouTube chat. It will again be hosted by Kai Draper. He'll probably be in a suit again. Likes to get dressed up if he's having his brief time out through lockdown. He'll be joined by Isabel Baffy from London, Jonah Nixon-Webster from Flint in Michigan, and Ellen Dillon from Ireland, maybe Dublin. She was in Dublin, I'm not sure if she still is. And Miriam Matta, also from London. So that's another international poetry reading on the June the 25th. There's a Transmissions event tonight after on Transmissions Twitch channel. I think it's their last one of the first series of events, this broadcast tonight, and then again tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. That will be live now. We've got quite a few people on tonight, I think. I can post a link to that in the YouTube chat. Just saying hello to a couple of people who've said hello in the YouTube thing. There's David Charles, Nick Hallett, both saying thank you. Rachel saying their waving was in sync. Yeah, we've had some sync delays, but thanks for bearing with. James saying great thank you, and Susan and Andrew. We both enjoyed this interesting discussion on the performance. Fascinating piece. So thank you all for tuning in tonight, and hopefully see you on June the 11th in 2 weeks for Sarah Lowndes' talk on Derek Jarman and Prospect Cottage. Good night, stay well, stay safe, wash your hands and stay alert.